Monotype. Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, the show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Terrance Weinzierl, and today I'm speaking with Sofie Beier. Sofie is a professor of design at the Royal Danish Academy, where she studies legibility and accessibility, and is the co-founder of TIP, a design research studio. So my experience with legibility in design is a little muddy. It's a combination of study and experience, some books, some coaching, some doing. And I stumbled on Sofie's first book years ago, probably from a blog or a newsletter. And I think Sofie's work has made that topic more approachable and just really clear to me. She presents legibility from a designer's point of view. As we talk about in this episode, there are some truths and myths to it, and a lot of unanswered questions about the phenomenon of reading. So I wanted to introduce Sofie and her work and show that legibility is not as intimidating as you think it is, but rather another element of design that you can use as a tool to succeed in whatever you're making. Cadley is here to preview this episode with me. Hey, Cadley.
Hi, Terrance. How are you?
Pretty good. What you been up to?
Just content strategizing about fonts and enjoying some warm Denver spring weather.
Yeah, same. Looking for the spring weather. Had a nice bike ride yesterday, and the birds are chirping, the flowers are growing, and life is good.
Yeah, days are getting longer too. So you spoke with Sofie Beier this week about legibility. What is legibility, and why should designers care about it?
Well, legibility is being able to simply differentiate one character or one word from another, I would say. And designers should care because it's the whole point of making something to read, to get your message across. The exception is art that's made to be illegible on purpose. And that's cool. There's a place for that. But legibility and readability is all about clear communication signals for that reading process. And typefaces themselves are an inherent part of that. But they have a bonus of triggering emotion and memory in the way that they look. And I think it's amazing, which is why I love type. It's this form and function thing.
Agreed. What's something that you learned about legibility from this conversation that surprised you? I think
one surprising reminder is how much legibility can vary depending on the situation. It's all about the use case, You could think of an extreme example like book design or road signage, and they're using very different approaches to achieve that comfort level. It's micro and macro typography at the same time. In other words, it's not just the typeface, it's also how you use it.
It's a very important distinction. Well, thank you for hosting, Terrance. Let's turn it over to you and Sofie for today's episode.
I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Sofie Beier, who is a professor at the Royal Danish Academy, where she's head of the Center for Visibility Design, which is to say where design meets how we see and read. She is the author of multiple books and pieces of research on legibility and design, including my favorite, Reading Letters, Designing for Legibility, the Type Tricks series, and one called Readability Research. So welcome, Sofie.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's get into it. I think if you imagine a Venn diagram of overlapping circles, right? In my experience, there's a lot of people with overlaps in art, typography, and graphic design, this kind of cluster. But I think there's very few people who have this science and type overlap. So I'm curious about your origin story, how you came to study legibility, and do you have an early memory of becoming interested in legibility?
As a child, I had great difficulty with reading. Everyone else learned to read, I couldn't. And it later turned out that I had dyslexia, or I have dyslexia. So I think that the fact that letters and texts and books in that way have been very difficult for me and I struggle interacting with them. It made me want somehow to fix that issue. And obviously, where I am today, I know that that cannot be fixed. But I think it was an early driver for me as well.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I know that there must be so many people that relate to that experience. I get asked about dyslexia occasionally, and there just seems to not be a black and white answer or really a perfect solution to recommend. Why is dyslexia such a difficult problem to solve typographically, or what do people misunderstand about it?
I would say if there's one misunderstanding, it is that dyslexia is a visual deficit, because mostly it's a phonetic deficit. That being said, it is also a lot of other things. And unfortunately, we don't know enough about what causes dyslexia. It appears that there are different components that play a role, and people struggling from dyslexia do not necessarily struggle from the same things. So what we know from the literature is that there appear to be a subgroup of people with dyslexia who suffers more from the effect of crowding, which is neighboring letters seeming to melt. This group would likely benefit from a wider spacing. But in general, I would say that if you want to design for dyslexic readers, then make a good design that works for everyone. And the many typefaces out there that sort of claim to fix dyslexia, that does not work that way.
Just swapping to a crazy typeface does not solve the problem.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about how you came to study legibility.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a background in graphic design. Many years ago, I was working as an independent graphic designer. And while doing that, sometimes I had breaks between clients. And I started designing typefaces, but I wasn't really schooled in that. So I was trying to find books that could help me be a better type designer. And while doing that, I was looking for material on how to design legible typefaces, how to design for specific audiences, and I couldn't find it. So I was like, hold on, I can write that book. I should write that book. And I didn't really know anything about it. So I got all the books I had. I put them into my suitcase and I went for 1 month holiday at my parents' place in Mozambique. They were living there at the time. So I went there was no internet, and I started writing the book. And after a month, I realized, no, I need to know more about this. I cannot just do it like this. So then I decided that I wanted to do a PhD in legibility. And at that time, it wasn't possible to do that in Denmark. So I had to go somewhere else. So I went to the UK and did my PhD there. Yeah, so that was how I started it.
Wow, that's amazing. I agree. I think a month is not long enough to start a book. And I think that's a beautiful sentiment too. It's like you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
So to speak. Yeah. Were there any other maybe mentors or motivators that led you to that line of study? Or was it just frankly you saw an opening that was there for the taking?
Yeah, I didn't know anyone at the time in the field. Luckily, I got to know people afterwards. So, for example, doing my PhD, I got in contact with Kevin Larson from Microsoft, who is a very skilled readability researcher. And then when I had my PhD defense, Mary Dawson from the University of Reading was one of the opponents. And she also works with the legibility research. I was lucky that I got to come and stay with her for half a year later, so I could sort of follow her on the side in her work. So I think those two people were the sort of most influential researchers in my early career.
And before we get further into talking about legibility in particular, I suppose it'd be a good time to talk about your studio. And it looks online that really, like, you present yourself as really one of the only commercial research studios in the world. I'm curious why it might be the only of its kind and how you work with graphic designers on that stuff today.
You should always be a bit cautious saying you're the only one, but I haven't been able to find anyone that does the same thing as we do in TIP. So I have I have my academic work on one side where I'm a professor, and then I had I'm a partner in the company TIP on the side. And what we do is that we help companies and designers test their typefaces. So we can both test the finished work, and we can also test in the process to make sure that it is evidence-based. And you could say that for the designer, what we can help with is to either confirm or disprove the assumptions, but we can also help make it easier to convince the client that this is the right solution. Clients like having reports that are more evidence-based and less art, you could say.
Yeah, that's my experience in type design as well. I think a lot of people are not patient enough for it, but I would love to work with you on something when the opportunity arises. So I'm just waiting for that to happen. When people are designing a new typeface family, how do you think they should go about planning for legibility?
I think first of all, they should think about who will be the people reading the typeface and where in the environment will the typeface be shown. But designing for specific situations definitely helps you, because there are situations where certain aspects are more important than others. When you design for small sizes, crowding, the merging of letters is more important than if you design for text up close. And for small sizes, you should think more about the balance between the black and white areas than you would necessarily in a display typeface. So knowing the media, knowing your audience, those two things will help you along.
I think that's very true from my experience too. The more precise the design brief is, the better. Even if you have to write your own design brief, try it. It might help you make more informed decisions and more confident decisions about the family in general. For people who don't think about typography often, what are the real world consequences of poor legibility?
Yeah, I think there are many reading situations where it's not so important, and then we have many where it really is. So we have situations such as medical supply, we have road signage, we have the display in cars, we have the safety material. So those are all situations where if you can't read, then the possible difficulties have like big consequences. So that, you could say, is one side of legibility. The other side has to do with readability, the comfort of reading. When you sit down with a book, do you read it easily, or do you have to struggle with the text?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a study that we did at Monotype with the MIT Age Lab, and we were looking at, it was at least a decade ago, but we were looking at glance times in a vehicle HMI and comparing very open humanist design like Frutiger to a very closed, grotesque design like Eurostile. And we're comparing the humanist typeface obviously was a little bit faster, and things like black shapes on a white background were faster too in that particular study. I'm also reminded of, speaking of like when things go wrong, but I'm reminded of this Seinfeld episode where they get lost in this parking garage.
Hey, this way!
Where's the car?
Well, I thought it was here.
You don't know where we parked?
And they keep wandering around forever.
Everything looks the same, but like rats in some experiment.
I think that is to say a lot of the designed world is just kind of mediocre, and it flows by almost invisible. And we don't notice it unless it's very good or very bad. Would you say you have the typographer's curse where you are constantly analyzing typefaces in your world?
I wish I could say I had that, but I actually don't. I think I'm a very normal person in that way. When I'm off from work, I'm just like other people walking the street. I obviously notice when something is very illegible and when something is very good. But I think the essential part is, and what also fascinates me is you could say the invisibility of typefaces. And sometimes it's a bit odd occupation that I have, in that people only notice my work when it goes wrong. If it's working, if it's legible, then they don't notice it.
Yeah, and I think, to stay on this topic of legibility and readability and kind of the distinction between the two, I think of being able to differentiate, one character or one word from another is part of it. And that might be really closely tied to the typeface itself. Whereas readability, the reading comfort, as you described, is a little bit more about the typography itself, which is to say how you use the typeface. Is there anything more you would like to, describe about the distinction between legibility and readability?
I think you did it well. Readability definitely has to do with lettering, with the spacing, with all those things. Whereas legibility is related to how easy it is to recognize the words and the letters. One thing that I might be a bit cautious about would be to say that legibility is related to the misreading of letters. It is that, but it is also a lot of other things. And sometimes what I feel is that designers think that the minimizing the misreadings of letters will fix the legibility. And that is not always the case. It's not the whole story. No.
Yeah, there's a lot of variables. When you are studying legibility scientifically, what things are you actually measuring? Is it reading speed? Is it eye movement? Is it errors, fatigue, comprehension?
We are looking at all those things. When we talk about reading, it's easy to think that it's one process, but really it's a very complicated process of multiple different operations in the brain and in the eye that makes it possible for us to read. So when we talk about legibility, for example, vision sciences would never use that word because it's too broad. They would talk about visual acuity, they would talk about crowding, other aspects like that. And when it comes to readability or reading longer paragraphs of text, they would look into the eye movement, the reading speed, the perceptual span, which is how many letters you can actually see in one fixation. All these micro elements of the bigger picture of reading that we study individually, because if we try to study reading as a whole, we can do that, but quite often a lot of things play in at the same time, and it's difficult to isolate the things that we're actually looking for.
Yeah, that's true. There are so many variables, and I think that's what is intimidating about legibility for a lot of beginners, for sure. It must be hard to design a new test. Is it helpful to repeat certain test scenarios to compare one set of results to another?
Yeah, so that is basically also this very scientific approach to making experimental designs, which is that if you first have designed a study, then it's been validated and published, and therefore you can reuse that experimental design for other things.
Mm-hmm. Is it hard to avoid aesthetic preferences in these kind of reading tests? Wouldn't someone just enjoy reading one typeface more than another?
When we test, we try to separate the two, the performance and the aesthetics of it. But in a way, we can't really separate them, because what we see is also if a typeface has good performance, that means that it creates easy reading, and therefore typically the users would also like it aesthetically. It also doesn't cover the whole aspect of what a typeface can do, because typefaces have meanings, they have semantic associations. They can also convey personalities, and all those things we can also test. And I think that's the wonderful thing about typefaces, that it both has a function, but it also has this other role in conveying a message that sometimes is way more subtle than what you would otherwise do in, for example, a visual identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of another study that Monotype did with a company called Neurons, but that test was all about the emotional response of typefaces. And we looked at whether one typeface looks more trustworthy than another or more memorable than another. And, the results were stronger than we thought they would be. Is there one thing that people, including designers, believe about legibility that the research doesn't actually support? Are there any kind of bad habits or myths that you could help bust for us?
I think the biggest one has to do with this idea that high letter differentiation results in legible typefaces. For example, I often hear the argument that the digit 1 should have a bracket at the bottom because that will differentiate it from L and I. That L should have a tail also to differentiate those three from each other. And I think very much depends on the use of the typeface. For example, if you're designing for a password, or if you're designing for signage, for example, where you are numbering different rooms, and these characters have to live their life on their own, then it's definitely important that you are completely sure what you're looking at. But if that's not the case, then adding these extra features to characters that are normally not seen as such actually turns out to be more problematic. If you make the number 1 very wide, then users will start to wonder whether it is a 1, because in their memory of how a 1 looks like, it's narrow. And what we have also shown in our work is that both in regards of letter shapes and digit shape, the shorter the letter skeleton, or the more simple the letter skeleton, the easier it is for people to recognize the letters. So sometimes you tend to add extra features to differentiate the letters, but by doing that, you're actually doing something else that is not so good.
Like you're introducing a new detail that might not match their pattern recognition.
Exactly, yes.
That's true. I think there is so much context to that. How about the sans versus serif debate?
Yes.
I think serifs are not always better and lowercase is not always better, right?
True. If we take the sans and serif debate first, that has been going on for years and years. That's like a historical debate that goes way back. And I think what is important to note is that the absence or presence of serifs, that's not the biggest part of the letter. A lot of other features that are way more important for a letter to be recognized. The stroke contrast, the X height, the width, all those things actually play a stronger role than the presence of serifs. There are some studies that show that at small sizes, sans serif might perform better than serifs. I don't want to say that as a claim, because you could easily design a serif typeface for small sizes that performed well, also better than some other sans serif typefaces. I think the discussion is we should move beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of, maybe road signage, for an example, where in that case, there's a lot of the viewing distance can be very far. And also back to the idea of context, but you might be driving at night and the sign is reflective. And then you have this optical thing going on where the letters are glowing, this halo effect or halation from the letters themselves. And so I think it's a combination of the viewing distance and the reflective material that necessitates maybe not only the simplicity of a sans serif in that scenario, but also the spacing itself too. You can imagine how muddy a serif typeface would look in that particular setting.
True. The serifs would basically take up space that is needed for other things. And in such a situation, the focus should be on the space within the letters and the space between the letters. And opening up the counters would definitely also help. So on lowercase and capital letters, there isn't so much research on that, but I think the main issue here has to do with the reading situation and also what we're used to reading. Because capital letters actually have a role to play in situations where it's important to make the letters as big as possible, because they're better at using the space, basically. Mm-hmm. I remember a study a while ago that actually found if you read a well-known, I think it was city names maybe, then having a capital in the beginning and lowercase letters, that made it easier to recognize than full capital. And that is related to what you're used to reading, that you're used to seeing this collective image of letters in this combination, and therefore it becomes easier to read. And the same way also when you read longer paragraphs of text, we don't like reading them in capital letters because that's not what we are used to.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that is one of the myths, that the word shape of the lowercase is not the whole story either.
True. So it's not the outline of the word that is the most important. It's a combination of what's going on within the letters and around the letters. So everything is important, not just part of what we see.
So one of the main themes in your reading letters book was familiarity. And you just mentioned it, that the familiarity of the kind of typesetting, so to speak, would have an influence on the legibility. And it reminds me of things like black letter type styles, which Americans might recognize as, Old English kind of things, very dense, sharp lettering styles. And even to this day, things like cursive handwriting, which is to say, a connecting script that you might learn in elementary school. And, I think these two are examples of type styles that have receded from familiarity and therefore have become less legible. Tell me more about this type of familiarity and what you think of these kind of styles receding.
So when I look at this, I try to separate the perceptual aspect of the letters with what you could call the lived experience of seeing the letters. And I think what is fascinating is that it turns out our lived experience with a certain typeface style in some situations actually overrule what we would expect on a sort of a perceptual level would be difficult. And I think the black letter scripts is a good example of that if you look at it with the sort of a vision science view, you say, okay, so these are very heavy typefaces with very small inner spaces. They're very tightly spaced also. But back in the days where they were the norm, we can see in the historical literature that people prefer to read those over the Roman style. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like if you lived in Germany in 1850, you could probably read black letter faster than Roman styles because that's what you were trained to read.
Yes, that's what the archives tells us anyway.
And I think it was Susanna Lico from Emigre fame who said you read best what you read most. And I think that's a great way to summarize it. For legibility in the future, I'm thinking about technology like augmented and virtual reality, where you are wearing goggles or seeing a digital representation in a new way that is not as familiar as a flat sheet of paper or a flat screen. And I think that these new technologies really combine the concerns or issues of screen typography with viewing distance and motion. So certainly we can use, existing font solutions like variable fonts with perhaps optical sizing to kind of adjust for that viewing distance, right? You might have something with a display version that is spaced a little tighter. Maybe the drawings are a little different. Maybe the X height changes. And things that are further away in that view are maybe looser, maybe heavier, and might have other design attributes to them. Do you see anything else that is problematic or successful with this kind of technology?
I would kind of like to start sort of a different place. And I think for me, this is a very exciting development, because if we look at the history of reading, we used to read in books. And then sometime in recent years, we basically turned to the screen, to the phone. Sometimes we can change the size of the typeface on our phone, but mostly we are still reading the same way as we used to when we were reading in books. And we are still reading books, but sort of in the broader picture. And I think what is happening now is it's giving us the option of reading in a way more dynamic way. And in regards of type design, I agree with you that it gives us these options of using what variable typefaces actually can give us in real time. And what is also new here is that we are going to read it in the environment. So we are going to have text on top of whatever we see. And how do we do that the best? Like we can't have like black backgrounds because then it erases what we are looking at. So the typefaces need to have certain attributes that wasn't necessary before. So for me, it's a whole new interesting area in my field that is opening up, and I would very much like to look further into this. In regards of virtual reality, what is also giving us is a huge screen. So there's no limit to how big the area that we can present the typeface is. So that also helps people with low vision, for example. If you need to read text with very large sizes, then maybe you can actually do that. So it can allow reader groups that couldn't read before, maybe they can read with these new technologies.
Mm-hmm. I suppose there's an element of use case there too, where, speaking of readability, you're probably not going to read a book through a virtual reality environment, right? So maybe there's a fringe there. But I'm also reminded of OXO, these kitchen utensils that were designed in the 90s. The design brief was, how can you make a utensil more comfortable for someone suffering from arthritis? And they made these big, soft kind of rubber handles. And it turns out like everybody likes the big, soft handles, right? And so I think about, designing for legibility or designing for usability in that way. Even if you have a very small niche target, you might make the experience more comfortable and easier for a larger audience.
Yeah, that's a good point.
From your perspective, what would the type industry, that is to say, people who make typefaces, what would they gain from empirical testing? Putting typefaces in front of readers in a way that was much more of a regular part of the design and development process?
I think there are multiple different gains to have here. So one is related to testing your own assumptions and see if they actually hold. As designers, we need to have the assumptions about how the world works because we don't know everything and we need to rely on our own training. But when it comes to reading, there are so many different things that play a role and we can't foresee everything. So actually having that as part of the design process, I think would help many designers in informing their work. The other side is the whole communication with the client. Many clients like to have evidence-based design. So they have sort of an insurance saying that, yes, this works, that this functions. And it makes it easier to have that dialogue with the client, that you actually have data to back up your argumentations.
It's a really good example of the return on investment of a typeface. We say all the time that, a typeface is speaking for your brand 24/7. It's kind of always on and it's always present. And I think that there is also an emotional component to this, where if something is designed that is very legible and serves the audience the best way, it also adds, trust and calm and authority to that brand experience. So it's not just how that typeface in the brand looks, but it's also how that experience makes you feel that is so valuable. Things that are felt and not seen. So concluding here, I think, besides your own books and research, which I think are fantastic, I will vouch for them again. I am in the Sofie Beier Club. But what other resources would you suggest to students or professionals alike?
I try to suggest not only looking at design materials, so also looking at other fields, for example, reading research, vision science. Sometimes it can be difficult to translate into your own way of thinking. But for me, at least, it has been very helpful because you end up seeing things with a different perspective. What I also try to talk to the students about is this aspect of, especially when you design for legibility, to remember both that people are different. They can have different kinds of impairments. This can be long-lived impairments, but it can also be temporary impairments. It can be that you are at a hospital and you're very stressed, or you are on the street and it's very noisy. different situations makes it difficult for you to interact with a design, and that should also always be remembered. And on the other side also, we have different reading situations that also leave different requirements for the designer. As we talked about also, that signage has different needs than reading in a book, for example. And it's important to know and to remember what you're actually designing for there also.
Yeah, of course. It goes without saying that I think the best designs are thoughtful, but I think it's also why we use the phrase design practice so often, because it is a practice and you can't get better unless you practice. And it's also a way of saying that it's never complete. There might never be a perfect answer. There's more than one way to solve and approach things. And you have to find your own path to success that way. Sofie, I know legibility is not the only thing you're interested in. You talked about being a graphic designer. What else do you like working on?
So at the moment, I've started looking more broadly at human cognition, I would say. So the limitation of the human mind. So I'm taking my work on legibility, on the smaller aspects of our interaction with design, which has to do with the letters, and then trying to zoom out a bit, because there's something fascinating in how to design for what we as humans are actually capable of interacting with. And what interests me is that designers often you sit with your work for a long time and you get very familiar with your design, and you think that everyone will interact with it the same way as you are because you know it. And it surprises you that no one understands the way that you have thought it should be interacted with. So this whole way of people, when we interact with designs, we have prior experiences that follow us along, that we are not a clean slate. When we see a piece of design, we expect to interact with it in the same way as we interacted with a similar design before. All those things, I think, are highly interesting. So basically taking my interest in legibility and zooming out a bit, that's sort of my new hobby.
It reminds me of when my son was very young, because he was born into a world that is always internet connected and that touchscreens exist. And so I remember seeing him walk up to a screen in an airport or like a public space, and he started touching the screen, and he was surprised that nothing happened, because he expected every screen to be a touchscreen, because that's his lived experience, right?
Yeah, that's deeply fascinating, because he's going to carry that with him also growing up until he meets enough screens that he cannot touch. Then he learns that.
Sofie, I can tell that you are a brilliant and dedicated person. I'm curious what you do to unwind and relax, or what you do for fun in Copenhagen.
So my husband and I, some years ago, we bought an old house at the countryside in Denmark. We are renovating that. It takes a long time, but we're trying to renovate it ourselves. So I'm learning all kinds of skills doing that. It's really nice doing something else, because normally I'm so much in my head and with my computer, and acquiring these skills that is very much craftsman based in how to fix whatever in all kinds of things in a house like this. That makes me relax in a different way.
I'm not surprised that you would choose yet another labor of love, like renovating a house. I'm not surprised at all. Thank you so much, Sofie. I really enjoyed talking with you today. You have shared just a mountain of knowledge with us, yet I think there are more mountains to climb, obviously, in front of us. But that's what I really love about design. No matter how much experience you have, there's always more to explore, learn, and practice.
Thank you, Terrance.
To see what Sofie is up to, follow her on LinkedIn.
Thanks for listening. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate us, and share us with a friend. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan. We'll be back in a couple weeks. Take care.